Good morning. Can you all hear me on Zoom as well? Okay. This talk is part of the course that's happening on compassionate action. And it's also, in my feeling at least, part of the Precepts Initiation Ceremony that will happen tomorrow, where 6 members of the Sangha are taking the precepts. And so I thought it would be good to open it up to everyone. So it's, on the one hand, a continuation of the conversation that some of us are already having, and it's also the context for this ceremony tomorrow. I'm doubtful about everything. I don't know. I find it quite useful, that there's doubt just doesn't go away, and yet we find some way of existing in the world with this body, this crazy mind, in a society that is, with other people, difficult to live with, wonderful to live with too. We find a way. So, I'm doubtful about Buddhism. Why these forms? Why exactly like this? Why not some other way? Right, so, but if we want to make some kind of sense, there's some inheritance that I have of this practice. It has proven itself useful and valid through my own practice and experience. So I feel also a certain confidence to talk about it, take it, pass it on, like that. So this ceremony is that we'll do tomorrow is inherited over time. It's what are the basic actions that are taken? It's like a commitment to the precepts, common sense ethical guidelines, which I want to talk about a bit. And also an entering into the lineage teaching of, like I just said, not with some dogmatism, but with a respectful with respect for its usefulness and validity, and also with some reasonable doubt that things can evolve further and become different and so forth. So one thing for me that's notoriously difficult to explore and think about is ethics. And these precepts that we'll be talking about, and some of you will receive and commit to, are a way to express an ethical attitude. Ethics, is about how we treat each other, and it's about, if you think about it theoretically, it's about distinguishing between good and evil, between beneficial and harmful. But already there, it's just a morass from a theoretical point of view. I recently read someone who says, is a kind of a critique of Western Buddhism, or anyway, that's good enough to say. And this person says, there's no ethics in Buddhism that holds up to 21st century Western standards of ethics. It's like this ancient collection of rules. There's a Sangha that came together around Shakyamuni Buddha, supposedly, and then they lived and interacted, and then, people did stuff that wasn't so good for the community. So you wrote down some rules, and then soon enough, lots of rules, like lots. It's just pragmatic, when a problem occurs, you make a rule about how to not have that problem reoccur. But philosophically speaking, when you think about a philosophy of ethics, you want to have some principles that you can rely on. And in a way, when you look at the precepts, these rules of behavior, you want to dig a little deeper and say, like, what are the principles behind that? What can we really rely on? And that's where the trouble begins. It's difficult to do. It takes something like Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. It goes something like this. Act in a way so that the principle that underlies your action can become a universal rule. That's pretty profound. Don't engage in action that is based on some principle that couldn't apply to everyone or in all situations. For example, if you lie, which we know, lies are problematic because they erode trust between people. So if you take the principle that underlies lies, which is save your own ass, protect yourself by concealing the truth, or gaining some advantage by saying that something is true which isn't true, and trick people into believing something. If you take that principle and you make it a universal rule, then society doesn't work, It just collapses. But, as I was taught in high school, if you look into a universalist ethics like Kant's, I grew up in Germany, so you get an example, like you live in Nazi Germany and you're hiding a family of Jews in your basement, and the secret police comes knock at your door and says, like, are you hiding Jews in your basement? And then you apply Kant's universal or categorical imperative, and you say the truth and says, yes, I'm hiding Jews in my basement. Would that be ethical action? Well, according to Kant, you can't lie. But it's clear to us, we want to lie in that situation. We need to lie. So, it's messy, right? So you see? And on top of it, what is good and evil, what is beneficial and harmful, varies according to context and situation, and was different at different times in history. So universalism breaks down. Shucks. So the alternative to universalism, philosophically speaking, is relativism, which is moral principles and rules of conduct and ethics are culture bound. They are, different groups of people make different kinds of rules. Empirically speaking, that's just the fact. It's just a fact. But it's not very satisfying. Because with a relativistic approach to ethics, you end up in a world where, groups can just make up their own rules. And it's like, well, we think this is fine, so then you have to condone that. I mean, the ethical rules of Nazi Germany, do we want to just say, well, that's what these people decided, or, some kind of code of conduct in a violent gang, or the mafia? In fact, it's true that different ethical rules apply there, but we want some kind of universalism, I hope, to be able to say that this isn't right. I think this shows up in an interesting way every time a Western politician journeys to China, and just like some expectation is built up in our media that human rights violations need to be pointed out to the government of China. I'm just making an example. It could be some other country that we think is less ethical than ourselves. And, it's always problematic. You want to have good relations with China, you depend on the trade, and the Chinese, ritualistically, just reject this kind of stuff, right? It's just like, why do you lecture us on ethics? We have our own way of doing things. Leave us alone. We don't point out how you are violating human rights too, which human rights definitely get violated in the West. So what do you do? From a relativistic point of view, you would say, just go to China and don't talk about human rights. It's not necessary. They have their own affairs. But, you could break it down and say, then nobody should ever say anything about someone else because these are my own affairs. What do you tell me about, how I should behave? I'm not certain about any of these things, but my intuition, let's say my ethical sensibility tells me that it would be wise to, if I'm imagining myself being this envoy to China of a Western government, it would be wise to practice what I would call invitational rhetoric. You continue to invite people into the framework of human rights. But before you do that, you practice clarity about your own behavior. You understand that human rights is an aspirational framework that we are adopting in this country and other Western democracies, and this aspirational framework, from our point of view, my point of view, makes sense. And we can invite others into that framework. So, in a way, it's like I don't have to give up a sort of universal aspiration, but it's not something to impose on other people as the truth about ethical behavior. But then it becomes a kind of never-ending path and negotiation and navigation of uncertain territory. It's not satisfying for someone who wants to ground this in, rationality or universal principle. It feels like a groundlessness that should be avoided. So I have a sense that there isn't like a fully explicated ethics of Buddhism that works in the 21st century. someone can point me to it, it would be great. I'm just not really aware of it. But we have these precepts. And in the Zen tradition, they are, from like a long, long catalog of, all kinds of rules. It's boiled down to 16 so-called Bodhisattva Precepts. A Bodhisattva is someone who's committed to the liberation of all beings from suffering. That in itself is a really interesting orientation. It's like the basis of our practice is the intent to end and liberate from suffering. In my view, it's a very pragmatic orientation. It's more pragmatic than theoretical. There's not like one set of approaches that can be derived from this orientation. There's lots of things, and we need to discern what applies from situation to situation. So it's situational and pragmatic, and it may not satisfy everybody's theoretical need for certainty, but nonetheless, it's an orientation, which is a lot. Clear orientation. So the Bodhisattva Precepts is to take refuge in the Buddha, to take refuge in the Dharma, and to take refuge in the Sangha, the three refuges. Now, we could give this a more Buddhist interpretation, but I also like, the Buddha is the dimension of, it's like first-person dimension. Taking refuge in the Buddha is your commitment to awakening, your commitment to liberation from suffering. The Buddha is a good example. And what matters is our own commitment to that path. So taking refuge in the Buddha means if you recite those refuges, it's like to recommit to this path of awakening and liberation. And you do it through through the study of your own aliveness and experience. And taking refuge in the Dharma, Dharma has lots of meanings, but let's say the teaching here and the path to implement that teaching. What is this teaching? From my point of view, if we have an open view about it, it's everything that contributes to liberation from suffering. Yes, traditional Buddhist teachings, but contemporary teachings that are non-Buddhist as well. So the Dharma can evolve. And it does have, that's interesting to me too, it does have a certain universal aspiration. When the Buddha teaches that the cause of suffering is, in my language, resistance, grasping, and delusion, greed, hate, and delusion, based on resistance and grasping and, I don't know, what is delusion? It's confusing concepts with reality. Taking stories to be what actually is the case. There could be other definitions, but I'm giving this now. That's universal. In principle, this idea is universal. It applies to everyone, everywhere. That suffering is caused by greed, hate, and delusion. Prove me wrong, Let's find examples where that's not true. Then we can drill a hole in this universalism. But, it's pretty good. So, committed, we in taking refuge in the Dharma, we're committing to listening carefully to the teachings that are already existing around the cause of suffering and how to end suffering, and also to a commitment to keep evolving those teachings and how they apply here and now in our situation, in our times. And refuge in the Sangha is the social dimension of how to live with others. We really don't see ourselves very well without others. First of all, we're really dependent on others, but even if you wanted to make a study of yourself independent from others, it's not very successful, I think. You all know the blind spot idea, but it's hard to see yourself. We need interaction to see ourselves. And to make progress in our own growing up and maturing. Then there are the 3 purifying precepts of doing good, not doing harm, and living for the benefit of all beings. I'm always stunned by this. It's by the simplicity of this. It's just stunning. And if you start to think about it, it's incomprehensible, because if you had to write an essay about what's good and what's harm, then you have this endless discourse about ethics that is it's incomprehensibly large. There's no end to that. And yet, there is a kind of moral sensibility that can be so clear in your experience about what is good and what is harmful, and you don't have to explain it. Right? So it's both. It's actually really difficult to pin down, and at the same time, it's extremely clear and precise. Now, personally, I think that ethics are grounded in what we have to call sensitivity or a sensibility, or a word that I like to use. It's grounded in a felt sense. It's not grounded in principle. Now, one quality of a felt sense that it's endlessly fascinating to me is that a felt sense is both vague and precise at the same time. Okay, so let's say, I have to make up some kind of example, but it's sort of a very general example. You are in a situation and you need to act. You need to do something. It could be anything really, like you have to go left or you have to go right. I'm just randomly, I'm recalling the situation. I was at the Berlin airport once, and it's now, it was a day where things were kind of warm and then they were just cold. The cold came in and froze everything at the airport. So nothing worked. And there were thousands of people, including myself, stranded at the Berlin airport. Everyone was jam-packed, and I waited for 8 hours to present my ticket and get a different ticket. 8 hours, like I was so grateful for sesshin practice. It's like without sesshin practice, I would have gone crazy. Like some people around me, just there's like a shortage of food, there's no water, your feet start to hurt, like you sit on your baggage, so I'm inching forward, 8 hours, right? Inching forward to the counter. And then this guy, who looked to me like some African king. He's like, he had these regal clothes, and he had his queen by his side, and he came in without having been in line like me for 8 hours, and he just cut in front of me and talked to the clerk. I mean, actually not directly in front of me. There was one other guy between me and this person who just sort of appeared and had this like uncanny confidence, like a king, of like, of course, I'm just going to the counter. It was stunning. So anyway, I'm digress. It's just a story. But I'm like, it feels like you have to do something. You have to say, hey, buddy, there's a long line, and you can wait for 8 hours too, or you just let it happen, I guess. Maybe there are other options, but those came to mind, those two. And it was clear to me that I wouldn't do anything. I would just let it happen. But the guy in front of me, right, he made the other choice, and he confronted this person. I thought, like, oh, interesting. You have to make a decision. What's right and wrong? I don't know. The guy in front of me was very angry. But it didn't help. I think if you have a kingly demeanor, you just get away with anything. You just do it. I guess. I really think he was a king. It's not, anyway, so I have to stop. I want to talk about the felt sense. So the felt sense is vague and precise at the same time. In other words, you couldn't explain all the ramifications of what you feel in your felt sense that lead to your action as this or that. But when you do the action, the felt sense is extremely precise in telling you whether that action is appropriate or not. I don't mean that in an objective sense. I mean that in a very subjective sense of whether you meet your own standard of rightness in the situation or not. It's a little bit like if you have something to say and you articulate it, like I'm engaged in that kind of activity right now, right? And I'm speaking from a felt sense. I know that the words that I'm letting come or that are coming mysteriously to express what I want to say, whether they are meeting my standard of conveying the meaning that I have in mind. It's pretty precise, because if I fail to say what I mean, I have to say it again. Like, I just noticed I want to make a point and there's time constraints for my talk. I can't keep talking about this situation at the airport, Although I like the memory of it. It's precise in that way, but I couldn't explain why, necessarily. I can hint at it, and I think that's happening with ethical theory. You can start to douse out some principles, but it's not, you can never exhaust it in an explanatory way. But there's still precision. And so, I think it's important to recognize how the felt sense is governing our ethical behavior, and how the rules that we make up are secondary. They are derived from a felt sense, and they are subject to revision. So in a way, I think ethical education needs to be an education of sensitivity, of the capacity for resonance, and for acting from a felt sense. Not an education in setting up rules and following them to the letter. I like a version of the 3 purifying precepts that says, doing good is to do wholesome action, and to not do harm is to refrain from unwholesome action. There's something in the English word wholesome that is useful to me. It's like to refrain from unwholesome actions, to refrain from sowing division, from setting up divisions that are too hard, divisions between self and other, between in-group and out-group, between self and world. When you set up divisions that are too harsh, you violate wholesomeness. Now, we can also, and this is where it starts to get complicated philosophically again, but it's like if you favor the whole over the part, you're also sowing division. Because now you make a division between the whole and the part, and you're saying the whole is more important than the part. If you want to be, interestingly paradoxical, you would say the whole is also just a part. There are all the parts, and then there's the whole. So the whole is just one of the parts. So we need to care for the whole and for all the parts. Like you could say, we need to care for the whole planet, and for the sake of the whole planet, we need to kill some humans. Which logically makes sense, but is ethically not defensible. Because the parts make up the whole. So if you kill off the parts, you are also violating something about the whole. Anyway, you get my point. Divisions are everywhere. Divisions are always happening when you set up this and that, and you want to identify with one side over the other. And that division, and then you divide and then you identify with one side, with that already you're going in the direction of unwholesome. And then there are so living for the benefit of all beings, that allness is undividedness. That allness is undividedness. Or, sometimes that's rendered as I vow to purify the mind. Purification sounds like you're getting rid of evil tendencies in yourself, or bad habits, and that there's some truth to that. But fundamentally, to purify the mind is to counteract the habit of creating divisions and identifying with one side. It's purifying the mind is to avoid one-sidedness. As much as possible, it can't be avoided completely, I think. Just to be alive and preserving our own life is a certain kind of bias. And we almost have an biological obligation to do so. Again, not in an absolute way, but mostly that's how we act. We make sure that we preserve our own lives, which makes sense. Now, the 10 grave precepts, I often say this, it's like if you want to practice the precepts, know them. It's the first. It's like just know them. Means you're able to recite them. I vow not to kill. I vow not to take what is not given. I vow not to misuse sexuality. I vow not to lie. I vow not to intoxicate body and mind. I vow not to, I keep working on these formulations, not to denigrate others. I vow not to elevate the self. I vow not to be possessive of anything. I vow not to harbor ill will. And I vow not to abuse the 3 treasures. It comes full circle. You vow not to abuse the 3 treasures. You treasure the path of awakening. You come back to the 3 refuges. You don't poo-poo the 3 treasures. Oh, it doesn't matter, I mean, it shows up. How does it show up? It shows up, it's like, oh, well, I'm kind of tired of, investigating myself. And it's like you treasure the path of awakening. You remind yourself, in a way, how much it's giving you. It could be little things. You just know how it doesn't feel right. You don't feel as grounded. You don't feel as clear and awake if you abandon your practice. Just even temporarily, You travel, don't get to sit the way you used to. You observe what happens. I find it useful to distinguish 3 levels of practice with the 10 prohibitory precepts. You may have heard versions of this in different language, or you have your own ideas, but the way I have formulated this for myself is that there's one layer that is pretty, what word to use? It's kind of coarse and obvious. It's like the 10 prohibitory precepts guard against self-centeredness. They're just like guarding against it. It's like, don't do this. Don't engage in killing that is unnecessary. Don't steal. Don't, like the positive formulation I'm choosing for do not take what is not given. Practice contentment. Don't objectify people in your sexual activity. Don't treat them as a means to your own pleasure. That's self-centered, My pleasure is the most important thing, so it doesn't matter how I treat you. This is guarding against self-centeredness in this dimension of our existence, or, not to lie. We already touched on that. Guarding against seeking advantage from not telling the truth. By harming the social fabric. Right? It's happening at the highest level of politics in our country. It's just, we see it. It's eroding the society. It's disgusting, actually. It's amazing that it just can continue. It's like, what's happening? Okay, and then in the course that we have, some of us have been, the conversation that we've had in this course on compassion is, I brought up this idea that it's not the idea, but the phrasing that I have from my teacher, Baker Roshi, who speaks of interdependence. We thought about this last week and explored what that means and practice suggestions I gave and so forth. The precepts are a constant negotiation between independence, the preservation of self, the support of self, and interdependence, the dependence on others. Now, to speak of interdependence, which is, paradoxical or maybe too weird, but it points to something. It's like you can't get away from those two perspectives of connection and independence. They're intertwined. And when you have a precept like not killing, in which this becomes very obvious, it's like we can't survive without killing. I just sort of imagine, how do you live without killing? Yes, you can draw the line somewhere. You can refrain from killing animals, but you can't refrain from killing plants. I thought, what would it take to refrain from killing plants? It's like you have to live solely from fruits and seeds. And even then you would kill future life, because that's contained in the seed or in the fruit. No, actually you participate, because as you're defecating, you're spreading that. Okay, so seeds and fruits. I'm sorry, it does work. But it's, that's not really possible. No, it's a question, is it even desirable to aspire to such purity? It's like, make yourself different from all other forms of life. Maybe it'd be better to be like all other forms of life and acknowledge your dependency on other beings and be respectful of how their death is life-giving to you. Maybe that's a deeper kind of decency than to aspire to some kind of moral superiority that, pretends that it has clean hands. No living being has clean hands in this way, because all living beings sustain their life on the basis of death of other beings. I think it's just a biological fact. But again, you can prove me wrong, please. I mean that seriously. It's like we need to explore it in this way. What's true here? So then, it's a constant, then not killing is actually a constant negotiation of interdependence, of respect for what is life-giving in this, vast network of interconnected living beings, and sustaining your own life in the midst of that. I mean, so also if you have a precept like I formulated now, not denigrating others. Sometimes it's, not slander others or not speak of the faults of others. It's like, is it possible to live a life without criticizing anyone ever? Not speaking of the faults of others. Is this even desirable? So then what is the precept about? Like, there's also an ethical necessity to speak of the faults of others. So that's why I'm saying denigrating now, because we have to feel out this territory, is like to not put them down unnecessarily, to not start disregarding them as also belonging. So there is a complexity there. The complexity is, in the felt sense, it shows up as a kind of vagueness. You cannot come down hard anywhere. It's like not killing at all. It doesn't work, right? But to just kill without concern for others doesn't work. It's this negotiation of interdependence. It's present in all the precepts, always, and we can count on encountering ethical dilemmas in all those fields. I also think the list of 10 isn't complete, there could be others, but it's a good list, One of the breakthroughs for me in practicing with precepts was to recognize that when I was taught this, that Suzuki Roshi supposedly said, it's like when you break the precepts, you lose energy. When you keep the precepts, you gain energy, or you maintain energy. What does energy mean? It's like it's harming your own sense of aliveness when you lose energy. It's like it's actually deflating to break the precepts. When I recognize that this is true, then there's a new dimension. It's not like practicing with the precepts is like following rules and being a good person and standing, and I don't know, aspiring to some kind of moral admirability or something. It's about recognizing in yourself, in your own experience, how violating the precepts is harming your own sense of aliveness, if that makes any sense. Then it's not about I should do this, it's about I want to do this. I don't want to do this in order to not harm my own sense of aliveness. But the truth is, greed, hate, and delusion lead us, self-centeredness, lead us to violate our own sense of aliveness. Actually, just disregard subtle feelings we have that tell us not to do something, and we do it anyway. This is where the territory of the precepts is. Because every time you notice you're doing something like this, you can renew your commitment. This other phrase that I was told Suzuki Roshi used, it's the precepts are, or practice with the precepts is like a spring wind over a burned field. It's like when you notice how you're violating something in yourself, like a moral clarity or what you think really is right. It's like it's a kind of destructive force, like that fire that burns the field, right? And a renewal to the commitment of practicing with the precepts is a renewal like spring. There can be new growth. There can always be a new beginning. There's no end to this practice. You don't have to accomplish anything. You just renew like spring does. Okay, the third level, which we don't have time to go into, the most important, I need to stop. It's I call practicing intimacy. But I'll just see if I can boil it down, and maybe in the discussion we can touch on it more. It's like intimacy is the practice of removing division. It's like you all appear, let's just say you appear within my field of awareness, and I appear in your field of awareness. And this situation that we appear within each other's minds, if that makes any sense to you, it doesn't get more intimate than that. Even if I try not to be disturbed by you, I can never get rid of being disturbed by other beings, because they are part of my life. Just in this very, obvious way that they appear. So killing is like this idea of like, well, if I can get rid of this, then I will not be disturbed. So you could look at it a different way. The practice of intimacy is the willingness to be disturbed by others. To give up your resistance to being disturbed by others. It doesn't mean that you are going to stay in the presence of someone who harms you, but you are fundamentally willing, you already accept that there will be disturbance by so-called others, that life isn't going to just be without disturbance. If we could practice that, the willingness to be disturbed without becoming foolish and letting ourselves be harmed, harm meaning, lasting dysfunction is inflicted on me, which I could also avoid by just stepping aside or separating from someone who doesn't care about my well-being. But I don't have to be driven into violence against, somebody, if I can practice this willingness to be disturbed. Anyway, this is obviously ethically difficult territory. We can count on all kinds of dilemmas to appear here. Thank you very much.